Welcome back, Pokemon fans. Let's talk about the world of Pokemon. The setting of the largest franchise on the planet is one that seems fairly simple on the surface. You catch Pokemon, become the very best like no one ever was, earn 8 badges, and become champion. This straightforward structure is part of the reason Pokemon is so accessible to everyone. But once you start digging a little deeper, it's pretty clear things get a lot more complicated. I mean, after all, in the Pokemon world, people fight in the streets all the time with giant monsters, and they even rob each other when they win. Not to even mention the fact that the world has this kind of weird way of almost ending every few years. But the point is that when you look at all the stories that Pokemon has to tell, it's pretty clear that some things just don't add up. And if you've ever been left scratching your head about something in Pokemon, you're definitely not alone. So with that in mind, my name is Blaine for Bridge4 Games, and these are the top 10 plot holes in the Pokemon universe. Oh, and by the way, if you like the content we have here on the channel, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel to make sure that you never miss any of it. Alright, let's get started. Number 10. Where did you come from? As of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, there are over 1,000 Pokemon to find and capture throughout the Pokemon games. And while most of them evolve by battling and gaining experience, many of them evolve through other means. Some evolve through items, some need trading, and some have to be loved in order to unlock their true potential. Don't we all? And don't get me wrong, this is great. After all, it makes things less repetitive, and it even gives you the ability to have branched evolution. So what's the issue then? Well, many of these evolutions can be found in the wild. So how does this work? Did the Pokemon evolve and then get abandoned? Are there people who offer their services to love a Pokemon until he evolves? Do people just break into stores at night to steal stones to sell on a Pokemon black market? In the Pokemon anime, they did touch on this briefly, with Glooms evolving into either Vileplume or Bellossom due to fragments of evolutionary stones in the wind. And sure, this works for stone evolution Pokemon, but what about something like Dusknoir? I don't think the Grim Reaper is leaving his cloak laying around too often. The bottom line is that there's a lot of mysteries about how these Pokemon got into the wild, and after almost 30 years, we're still no closer to having an answer. Number 9. The Power of the Sun in the Palm of My Hand. Pokemon Sword and Shield were games that were very unique in the Pokemon series. They were the first main series games aside from Let's Go on the Switch. They featured Dynamax, and some of the most absurdly overpowered Pokemon the franchise has ever seen. But of course, through all the Pokemon games, some things will stay the same. And that's where Chairman Rose comes in. Like most evil villains, he has a plan to serve his own goals, and it goes a bit awry and we have to bail him out. In the case of Rose, he wanted to use Eternatus, the source of Dynamax energy on the planet, to power all of Galar. And while this is a very thoughtful goal, alien Pokemon are, well, alien to us. So controlling them and harnessing their power tends to be pretty tough. And in this case, Eternatus enters its Eternamax form and almost destroys all of Galar. And of course, in the end, everything is okay, thanks to Zacian, Zamazenta, and some tenacious preteens. But the thing is, none of this needed to happen. You see, Galar has another little Pokemon called Regieleki. And little's the operative word there. Just look at this happy little bouncy guy. Anyway, if we take a look back at our handy-dandy Galar Pokedex, it clearly states that Regieleki has enough energy in its body to power the entire Galar region. So, rather than messing around with all that Eternatus stuff, he could have just hooked some cables up to Regieleki, and boom, problem solved. And yeah, I can hear you through the screen. Regieleki was sealed in a temple for years, but Eternatus was dormant for just as long. Are you telling me, in all the research and preparation that Rose did for Eternatus, he didn't hear anything about another option? Regieleki is sealed in a temple, so obviously people knew about it, and since there's a Pokedex entry, the information about it must be out there somewhere. At the end of the day, it indicates that there are really only 3 possibilities. Either Rose is terrible at research, or maybe he just prefers the flashiest and most menacing looking option to power the region, or of course, the real answer. Pokemon needed a really big finale for their story, and Rose just drew the short straw. But regardless, when it comes to his character, choosing Eternatus over Regieleki is just a choice that doesn't make much sense at all. Number 8. A Joy by any other name? Okay, let's cut right to the chase. What is up with Nurse Joy and Officer Jenny? Found in both the Pokemon games and the Pokemon anime, Jenny and Joy appear in every major city, running the Pokemon Center and the local police respectively, but the thing is, they all look alike. And I don't just mean similar, I mean identical. Now, obviously, this is because they reuse the sprites in the games, and the anime wants to pay homage to that. Plus, it gives the anime the added benefit of having characters who are instantly recognizable, who also don't have to be redesigned all that often. The problem, though, is that no attempt is ever made to explain this. In fact, instead of just ignoring it, the anime makes references to it all the time, with no one except for Brock being able to tell them apart. So, how could this be possible? They make comments about them being sisters or cousins over the years, but this really doesn't even come close to an explanation. There have been over 50 different Joys in the Pokemon anime. Even if all of them are 1 out of 10 identical twins, and they all came from paired identical quintuplet parents, there would still be genetic variation. And on top of that, if they weren't born all at the same time as twins, some would be older than others. But again, all of them are exactly the same. And it goes beyond appearance. For the most part, all of them have the exact same personality and even use the same Pokemon partners. They are carbon copies. Now, fan theories have suggested they're all actually dittos, or robots, or clones, all of which do exist in Pokemon, by the way. But as it stands right now, we have a ton of women that would make a police lineup an absolute nightmare, and just no idea where they actually came from. Number 7. Breeding shenanigans. Pokemon Gold and Silver introduced one of the most beloved aspects of Pokemon to the series: breeding. What looked like a simple gimmick at first is actually an amazing way to get competitive Pokemon and get shinies. Plus, it's very easy to do, so you can do it in the background while you're doing something else, like your job. Hey, do me a favor, don't tell my boss about that last part. There's just one little problem. It doesn't make any sense. Now sure, if you put a male and a female of the same egg group together, or pair one of them with a ditto, aka a smush and cushion, you'll get a baby. All of this is fine, but it's all the other stuff that reveals some issues. For starters, any Pokemon with an accessory has it when they're born. Cubones are born with a skull and a club, Farfetch'd is born with a leek in its hand, and Timber is born holding a wooden 2x4. And if you think that's bad, how the heck is Kangaskhan born with a baby in tow? What is it, a tribble? And, oh yeah, speaking of Kangaskhan, they're all female, so they have to reproduce with a ditto as their only option. How did a species like this even come to be? Arceus would have to just blink one into existence, and then it starts making googly eyes with the pink blob sitting at the bar. Also, as I mentioned before, Pokemon are in egg groups, and any two Pokemon in the same group can breed. This can lead to some really weird pairings like Skitty and Wailord, Mareep and Garchomp, and even Charizard and Appleton. Oh god, we're gonna have American Pie Pokemon Edition, aren't we? And this doesn't even touch on the fact that two different species shouldn't be able to produce an offspring unless it's a hybrid. That kind of breeding wouldn't produce one or the other. But hey, that's just years of scientific research talking. What do they know? Look, the bottom line is that the entire topic of breeding in Pokemon is just a big ol' mess, and until we get a few biology books or more than one professor who studies breeding, it's gonna remain a bit of a head-scratcher. Oh, and while we're at it, when you get an egg, where does the ball come from? Number 6. Okay, so where does this go? One of the amazing things about Pokemon is that on top of the 1,000 or so Pokemon options we already have, you can further customize them by changing their stats, held items, or moves. The only issue is that the entire process of teaching them new moves really doesn't make sense. For starters, most Pokemon can learn moves through TMs. But how does this actually work? TMs are always shown as discs, and the closest explanation we ever get for how they work is all the way back in Gen 3, when you just mash the disc into the Pokemon's forehead and somehow it learns the move. Now, call me crazy, but there's gotta be a lot more to it. Are the discs inserted somewhere? Or do you just, I don't know, sit down and watch a replay of the move on a portable DVD player? It's one of the longest running mysteries in Pokemon that just has no answer in sight. But believe it or not, this issue pales in comparison to the moves themselves. For example, back when we had HMs, why did we need to teach them to Pokemon who could already do the move? Now you might be wondering what I mean, but think about this. Here we have a Pidgeotto and you can see that it's flying off the ground. But if you want it to know the move fly, you have to teach it to it. Same with Lapras. For crying out loud, it's such an obviously good swimmer that the surfing sprite sometimes just is a Lapras. Its category is even the transport Pokemon. So why do we need to teach it the move Surf to teach it something it already knows how to do? And as crazy as all of that is, sometimes the Pokemon moves just don't make sense whatsoever. Here, let's play a little game. Which of these 3 Pokemon do you think can learn the move Iron Tail? Empoleon, a steel Pokemon with a tail, Galar Meowth, a steel Pokemon who also has a tail, or Primeape, a fighting Pokemon with no tail. If you guessed Primeape, you're right. And there are many examples of this. Wooper and Ghastly get punching moves despite having no arms, Zubat gets Mean Look despite having a conspicuous lack of eyes, and Rhydon can learn Surf despite dying to even a drop of water. The bottom line is that the move system is a bit of a train wreck in Pokemon, and it's just another of those things we're not supposed to think about too hard. At least with each new generation, they constantly update all the mechanics of the moves, so hey, maybe we'll get some more details in the future. Number 5. That seems a little OP. Ever since Mewtwo first broke out of his lab on Cinnabar Island, leaving it in ruins, it's been pretty clear that there are some seriously powerful Pokemon out there. In fact, there are quite a few that could single-handedly destroy the entire planet. And I'm not talking about Pokemon like Tyranitar or Gyarados, whose Pokedex entries say they could destroy an entire town when they're mad. I mean Pokemon who could literally obliterate the entire world just by existing. Take Magcargo, for example. According to the Pokedex, its body temperature is 18,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which is almost twice as hot as the sun. And yeah, I mean, that does sound totally rad, except for the little detail that that temperature is more than enough to ignite the entire atmosphere and turn the entire planet into a giant lump of charcoal.
The field collapses, and that.
And then there's Gardevoir, who can create black holes that would swallow the Earth piece by piece. And of course, we also have Guzzlord, who would take the term swallowing a planet a bit more literally and just eat the entire thing. The issue boils down to the fact that in an attempt to make Pokemon super cool and super scary, they've created several hundred nukes that are in the hands of preteens. And this doesn't even factor in legendaries. Kyogre or Groudon drastically manipulate the weather just by existing, Yveltal kills everything around it, and Ultra Necrozma has literally obliterated entire universes. Oh yeah, and while we're talking about legendaries, every 3 or 4 years, there's some catastrophic event in the Pokemon world that threatens to destroy everything. But at the end of the game, everything goes back to normal. The world is saved from the brink of destruction and nobody ever mentions it again. It's almost like the story forgot these Pokemon can get out of hand, and then all the people in the games just kind of forgot too. The bottom line is that if the Pokemon world were real, this couldn't happen. Full stop. Some Pokemon at some point would have gotten completely out of control, or some shadowy government agency would control them and use it for their own ends. At the end of the day, there's just too many Pokemon that are too powerful, and that makes this whole thing just too hard to believe. Number 4. So what's the plan here? Pokemon villains have always been one of the more interesting aspects of the Pokemon games. They create the central threat, they usually have some goons who you're going to be battling over and over again, and more often than not, they have some tie-in with the legendary Pokemon you're going to have to defeat to save the entire world. The only problem is, they do things that no normal person ever would. For starters, let's take a look at their master plans. Team Aqua and Team Magma want to make the entire world either flooded or make it entirely land. And sure, this sounds interesting, but the one thing that they overlooked is that both of these scenarios would make the world entirely inhospitable for all the people on the teams. People need water to live, and people also need land to grow things like crops and food. One or the other is really not that great. And then there's good old Team Flare, who wanted to wipe out everybody except for Team Flare. Which again, for them, sounds okay, except for the fact that the world needs people to function. Unless Team Flare has farmers, doctors, and scientists, they're gonna be in seriously big trouble. But I guess these just amazing plans shouldn't be too much of a surprise, considering they come from the same leaders who order their grunts to go after you one at a time, instead of just swarming you to maximize their odds, and the same leaders who have grunts using underleveled Pokemon, and none of the weapons or technology at their disposal. It honestly just seems like they take any opportunity to sabotage themselves. Why else would Giovanni just give up at everything after being defeated by Red? And why would Cyrus, arguably one of the more intelligent leaders, choose to live in a world with no food and no water? And most ridiculously, why would Lysander tell every single person in Kalos exactly where to find him before he activated the ultimate weapon? If he had just kept his mouth shut, he probably would have won. The only way he was ever able to be stopped is because he told everybody exactly how to do it. We just see well-organized teams making dumb decisions too often for them to actually be well-organized teams. You know, I think the Joker said it best when he said that the world deserves a better class of criminal. Here's hoping. Number 3. What do you even do? Jobs in the Pokemon world are complicated. You wouldn't think that someone would just bail on being a Pokemon trainer to manage a Pokemart, but they do. And then there's some people who decide to dedicate their entire lives to service and join the police or become a nurse. Oh yeah, Pokemon has a police force. There's Officer Jenny, Looker, Annabelle, all those guys. But I'll forgive you for forgetting that the police exist, because they don't do anything whatsoever. In literally all of their appearances in the games, they investigate an incident and then just go tell the nearest 11-year-old and then just wait to arrest the bad guys once they're all defeated. Now sure, sometimes they tell you where to go and sometimes they help to progress the story, but why even include the police in the story if they literally don't even try to stop any crimes from happening? And it's particularly bad when you think about the fact that the world-ending type incidents happen so often. And with those, they don't even bother investigating most of the time. Record high sun and rain that's destroying the region? No biggie. Massive crystal weapon just rose up out of the ground? Business as usual. At least when it comes to something like a comic book or Power Rangers, the police allow a more experienced and more offensive force to handle things. But here, they're literally telling a 10-year-old to go save the world, and then they just go and sit on their rear ends. It's really one of the most unrealistic things in Pokemon, and that's saying a lot. Number 2. You look good for your age. Speaking of the ultimate weapon, in the story that gave us our just flawless timeline system for the Pokemon world, AZ used the ultimate weapon to annihilate 2 different armies, but it also had a bit of a side effect too. It made AZ and his Floette immortal. In Pokemon X and Y, we see that both of them are doing just fine after thousands of years. And again, this is all well and good, but no mention is ever made of this ever again. Nothing is ever done with the fact that immortality has been unlocked and people no longer have to die. And sure, you could argue that no one would know about it since it was underground the entire time, but what about when Lysander activated it? When that giant beam of light went into the sky? Yeah, people sure knew about it then. And then on top of that, AZ just happened to march his 9-foot body into a crowd of people to apologize to his Floette. Are we to believe no one looked at him and said, huh, that looks a lot like the old king of Kalos? And you know, he's the only other 9-foot person I've ever seen. I wonder if that has something to do with that giant glass machine that just came out of the ground. The fact that nothing ever came of death now being optional is just mind-boggling. And even if the machine has terrible drawbacks, scientists would absolutely want to study it just to learn more about the ultimate weapon, and possibly use it as a power source if they don't figure out the whole immortality thing. And heck, even archaeologists would want to study it just for its historical value. And even if all those scientists were just busy with something else, I'm sure at the very least, a Pokemon professor or two would want to come check out this brand new landmark the Kalos region finally has. But either way, it just feels like a huge oversight on the part of the games that is very, very worthy of number 2 on this list. And that brings us to number 1, and simply put, how does the Pokemon world even work? Okay, so far on this list, we've mentioned pretty specific things about the Pokemon world that don't quite add up. But number 1 is just the entirety of the world itself. How does it work? And yeah, I know that you're probably saying that it revolves around the sun with its 8 besties, and yeah, thanks, I got that part. But seriously, logistically, how does the world even work when it comes to economics? Okay, for example, money exists in the Pokemon world, which usually means that a government would be producing it. But does the Pokemon world even have governments? There seems to be no issue traveling region to region without documentation, and money acquired in Kanto is good in Johto, and money acquired in Paldea is also good in Unova, so maybe there's a world government. That works just fine for One Piece. But if that's the case, where does their funding actually come from? We never see taxes being a thing in Pokemon, and even if there were, I definitely suspect that most trainers would be underreporting their earnings from smoking all those trainers on Route 1 anyway. And if a world government, or any other government for that matter, actually exists, why have we never heard about it? Well then, maybe it's the alternative, and we're all just living in anarchy. I mean, kids already fight to the death regularly in the streets, so maybe there's just no government. I mean, we have monopolies like Silphco making all the Pokeballs for the entire world, so that tracks. But if that's the case, then who's paying for the police, schools, and Pokemon centers? They are free after all, so the money has to be coming from somewhere. And speaking of Pokemon centers, it's great that they take care of injured Pokemon for free and all, but where do injured people go? Sure, Pokemon centers can accommodate Pokemon trainer injuries, but what about some guy who just broke his ankle at work? Is Nurse Joy going to take care of the workman's comp? And honestly, that raises even more questions. Are there enough jobs for the people and for businesses to run, with most people just going and becoming Pokemon trainers? Is there insurance for injury by flamethrower? Do they have any way to prove that it was accidental, and not someone trying to commit insurance fraud using their kid's Charmander? Okay. Look, I know the actual answer here is that Pokemon wants to focus on the story and, the Pokemon, and you have a way to regularly get money in-game, so it works for what it is and we're not supposed to think about it that hard. But at the end of the day, anybody who's been adulting for any length of time can see that what we have here is not close to adding up even a little bit. And those are my top 10 biggest plot holes in the Pokemon universe. Did I miss any? Let me know in the comments. And while you're down there, remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with any of your Pokemaniac friends. But that's all I have for you today, so until next time, this is Blaine signing off. Make sure you have yourself a happy, epic, awesome, and amazing day, and until next time, always remember to be the very best like no one ever was.